Good morning, brothers and sisters. I spent this week preparing a sermon for the first Sunday after the Epiphany, I guess hopeful and naively thinking that we would be back together this week. And that hasn't turned out to be the case. So instead of preaching on Jesus as a young man in the temple and Mary and Joseph searching for him frantically around the city and all of that, I thought now is probably a good time to address our current situation in a sermon. Some of you who follow me or friends with me on Facebook, for example, or maybe have talked to me about these issues in person, have probably seen some of what I've written on these issues, but not all of you are privy to that or have access to that. So I thought maybe I would try to put something coherent together, and I'll be preaching on that this morning. So I want to first say I appreciate the people of Living Word Church. Like every church, or like the people of every church, you all have a variety of opinions of how we should be dealing with the pandemic and with the current health orders. Again, you all have been pretty gracious in dealing with differences, I'm assuming with each other, for the most part in talking to me about these things. This has been a very difficult time for churches and particularly for pastors, caught between the demands of some people who are adamant that we obey the government orders, some people even adamant that we go above and beyond what the government is requiring, and then on the other hand, you've got others who are adamant that we defy the orders or challenge them in some way. And in the midst of all this, I've lost count of the pastors who I know or am acquainted with, who some have been fired by their congregations for making the wrong choices in these matters, but more have simply broken down and quit in the last year. It's very discouraging to see. And I'm not looking forward to the aftermath of this, because once the dust settles and people are back in churches, I think we're going to see a lot of splits and divisions within congregations. Even in our own church, we've relatively recently lost one person who apparently felt that somehow we should be continuing our normal activities despite the health orders. And earlier in the year, we lost two people who were upset that we continued to meet during the spring, and then were upset that we didn't impose a mask order in the absence of one from the province. Now, I am not a doctor. No one in our congregation is a doctor. No one on our vestry, neither of our wardens are doctors. Health experts like our provincial health officer are there, and our government appoints them even what amount to basically dictatorial powers in an emergency. They are there for a reason. They are qualified to address these issues. No one in our church is qualified to make these decisions. And so we abide by the orders and guidelines given by the people who are qualified and who are placed in those positions of authority. If the experts issue health orders, for example, that leave the wearing of masks up to private judgment, a pastor or a vestry with no medical expertise has any business ordering masks to be worn when people come into church, because in doing that, they're binding the conscience of believers and effectively excommunicating anyone who's following the order and in their private judgment thinks that they don't need to wear a mask. Now, if the health officials tell us that we do have to wear masks indoors, then we will. Not because I or the vestry think it's a good idea, and because we issue an order for it, but because those in authority in the government who are qualified to issue such orders have told us to do so, and as good Christians, we have an obligation to submit to the civil magistrate. Now, that said, and I will come back to this issue of obedience to the civil magistrate later. I think it's important to address these issues. And here's how I want to address the issues today. First, I want to look at something called ecclesiology. You may or may not have heard that word before. Ecclesiology is a branch of theology that deals with doctrine about the church. Ecclesia is the Greek word for church. And so this branch of theology addresses things like who and what we are, what we do, and how we do it. Our ecclesiology answers important questions like, what does it mean for the church to gather? Do we have to do it in person? Can our gatherings be virtual? Things like that. So ecclesiology, I know I can't hear you, say it with me. Ecclesiology, it's a doctrine of the church. Now second, after ecclesiology, I want to look at our political theology. How does the church relate to the state and the state to the church? Where does the authority of one begin and the other end? What do we do when they overlap or seem to be in conflict? And finally, we'll bring this back to our current situation, which has been complicated, I think, by a broad failure of the church to adequately address either of these issues. So first, ecclesiology. The greatest failure, I think, has been here. And it doesn't surprise me in the least, or at least it shouldn't. For generations, a huge swath of evangelicals, mostly outside the confessional traditions and denominations, a huge swath of evangelicals has downplayed theology. You get a group of pastors together, try to recite the creed, and a good portion of them won't be able to do it. I've been sitting in a meeting just like that where that happened. So it's no surprise when the people sitting in the pews are theologically illiterate. Ecclesiology was one of the great subjects of the Protestant Reformation. So was political theology. But we have reached a point where we've got pastors who don't even know what the word ecclesiology means. I've been in that situation too. A big part of the problem is that for many years, and especially since the 1970s, evangelicals have been doing church not so much based on well thought out theology and ecclesiology, but based on pragmatic principles. Based on, largely, whatever will get the largest number of butts in the pews, or reach the biggest number of people. But a great deal of what we've done has ended up undermining the integrity of the church. We've downplayed things like commitment and sacrifice and submission to the lordship of Jesus, while turning the faith into something primarily therapeutic that's basically a private spiritual hobby that we do by ourselves. And the problem is that when something like the coronavirus hits us, well, we haven't thought these issues through. Or we haven't paid attention to our forefathers in the faith who spent a great deal of time thinking them through, and so we've got nothing solid on which to base our responses. Or as we've seen, we just fall back on the faulty, unbiblical foundations we've been building for the last 50 years. It's not surprising when we've basically presented the gospel and Christianity as an individualistic and private affair, that it's not that big a deal to then not meet in person. So it's sad, but not surprising that a lot of churches for decades, for example, have promoted the idea, and maybe not overtly, but promoted the idea that, you can legitimately go to church in front of the TV in your pajamas and with your coffee. It's not surprising that a church that has bought into that sort of idea, that has presented or done evangelism in a sense of undermining real commitment and presence in the church, trying to make things as easy as possible, as non-confrontation as possible, it's not surprising that such a church so quickly adopted this virtual church model that we've seen in the last year. Consider that in the spring, almost every church in British Columbia stopped in-person services. Now, the 50-person cap that was imposed on us by a health order in March, that certainly made things difficult for many churches, for the larger ones. But we've seen that that's not an insurmountable problem. Our Roman brothers and sisters, for example, understanding how important it is for the church to gather in person, eventually worked out a system which involves 2 services a day, 6 days a week. Is that more work for the minister? Of course it is. But a good minister is willing to do that on a temporary basis in order to see that the flock is taken care of. Other churches have been able to split their congregations into 2 or 3 groups, sometimes one group meeting in a fellowship hall and another in the church itself, because a health order allows 50 here and 50 there as long as they've got their own washrooms and separate entrances. For many churches like ours and many others in our community, the 50-person cap posed no real problem at all. But the fact is, most churches didn't even try. Most simply went into some kind of virtual model right away. Now, most of us did understand that this was a stopgap emergency measure, that this isn't how things are supposed to be. But that said, there have been quite a few pastors failing to make this distinction, and even some touting this as a new normal that's better than what we had before. I've been in a meeting with one clergyman who's excited and thrilled about the opportunities that this offers, and we're not going back to the old model. I can't count the number of people who have said something, or I've overheard saying something now like, I don't know that I'll ever go back. It's so much easier, so much more comfortable to watch at home, and I can do it whenever I want, not on someone else's schedule. Or people are saying things like, this has been such a blessing, we don't have to get the kids up for church. Hubby and I can just watch in peace while they play or while they sleep. This is so much better. And all of this is reinforcing that old half-truth, as I hear people say repeatedly, the church is not a building. By which they mean that the gathered public worship is not of the essence of the church. I've read over and over on comments on news stories about people who are protesting these orders, or some of the churches who are continuing to meet despite the orders. I'll get into that in a while. But in the comments, there over and over and over, you'll see people post, the church is not a building. That's where this has led us. A number of polls have been taken in recent months that are indicating that when this is over, attendance in churches will be down something like 30%. Either because people will continue to watch from home, or they'll simply have dropped out after months or a year of non-attendance. Brothers and sisters, that's a staggering and tragic number. And those who shut down when they didn't have to have contributed to the problem. Brothers and sisters, in-person worship is part of the essence of the church. It is not an optional add-on to something that we otherwise do privately. Again, going back to that statement people are making that the church is not a building, I said it's half true. It's true that the church is a people, not a building, but the statement is misleading, and here's why. To be the church, the people have to meet together, and to meet together requires a place. Whether it's a cathedral, or a storefront, or a home, or the shade of a great tree on the African plain. People have to have a place to meet. So you see, there's no such thing as an ecclesiological background if we don't take the time to develop a biblical ecclesiology, or at least to listen to our forefathers and what they had to say as they worked out the faith in terms of this at great length. Some kind of half-biblical and poorly thought-out ecclesiology will fill the vacuum. And this pandemic has put pressure on the church, and this is exactly what's been revealed. So what does the Bible say about the church? I mean, a year's worth of sermon could be spun out to address the answer to that question, but I'll try to answer it here relatively briefly. I'm sorry I will go longer today than I usually do, but I'll do my best. Let me go back to that statement again. The church is not a building. There's a reason why church buildings are so closely associated with the people who are the church. There's a reason why we've come to refer to both as church. To gather together in some place established for that gathering is of the essence of the church. Consider the very word church. The Greek word used in the New Testament is one I'm sure most of you have heard before, ecclesia. The word literally means assembly. And the New Testament writers use it to describe both the people who assemble and the assembly of those people. Pretty much exactly parallel to the way we use the word church to refer to the people assembling and the assembly of God's people. But the key here is assembly. The ecclesia does not exist apart from the assembly. The members can go from the assembly off to their own homes, to their work, to their other affairs, and be apart from each other. but they remain the ecclesia. They remain the assembly because they are part of the assembly when it does gather together. The church is defined by its physical gathering for corporate worship. Now, it doesn't mean it's not defined by other things. It's defined by things like our union with Jesus. But it is very significantly defined by its nature as a gathered people. There is no such thing as a church that does not gather in person, just as there is no such thing as a loner Christian. A person who, due to extraordinary circumstances, can no longer be part of our corporate gathering, say they've got medical problems and they've had to move into a nursing home. That person remains a part of the church because they've been part of the assembly. But you can't be part of the church if you've never been a part of the assembly. This is a problem with so-called virtual church. It may serve as an emergency stopgap in times like our own. It may even be a good thing in that respect, but it is not church. It is the church doing its best to maintain a connection and some kind of means or venue for teaching and worship under extreme circumstances. But if virtual church, whether it's today's live stream or the TV and radio broadcasts we've had for many decades, if virtual church is all you've ever been part of, you were not part of the church. This has always been the danger of broadcast church, and it's why responsible evangelism, while it may use these methods to reach unbelievers, always stresses the need for those it connects with by TV or radio or internet to join the physical gathering of the local church and to take part in the physical sacraments, baptism, the Lord's Supper, that mark God's people out as the church. We see this gathering, this physical coming together throughout the New Testament. Now, we don't have time to look at all or even most of those passages right now, but I want to look at a couple significant ones. First, let's look at St. Luke's description of the church just after Pentecost. It's in Acts 2, verses 42 to 46. Luke writes, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts." Think of those words there: fellowship, together, attending. These are the sorts of words that characterize the church throughout the New Testament. It's in our name, the assembly, because it's what we do. Those early brothers and sisters were known for gathering together to hear the apostles, to fellowship, to worship together. They shared common meals as part of their gatherings, and in those early days, the Lord's Supper was part of those meals, not just a ritual as it has become for most for most today. But all of this requires physical presence. And Luke says they were devoted to it. That word devoted in verse 42 is something we might pass over. But it's vitally important, particularly today. Even before the pandemic, many Christians showed a lack of devotion to the gathering of the church. Now, there will always be occasional necessities or times of travel or illness that prevent our attendance. Things we can't do anything about. But Luke's description here should prompt us to ask, are we really devoted? Do we prioritize gathering with the church to worship on Sundays? Or is church something we do when we don't have something else to do? Does our devotion inform our commitments? There are lots of competing options these days. Do sports or clubs take us away from the church? That means we're prioritizing them instead of the gathering of the church. Sometimes it's a more subtle competition. Do we neglect things that need to be done in preparation for Monday leaving them to the last minute so that we end up missing church in order to get them done? Do we do things on Saturday, or maybe Saturday night, that we know will leave us exhausted and unwilling or unprepared to get up for church on Sunday morning? Maybe we know getting the kids ready will be a hassle on Sunday morning, but we neglect to do everything we can to prepare them Sunday night, or Saturday night rather. These are all things that reflect our priorities, our devotion. In the pandemic, we might look at things like our non-church activities that expose us to infection and raise our risk of passing the virus to others when we do gather. If I have to limit the number of people I'm around during the week, I want to do everything I can to prioritize my activities so that I can safely include the church in that limited circle of people. Now, the other passage I'd like us to look at is Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 to 25. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is a habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, first, notice how the gathering of the saints together has a familial aspect to it. We saw this in the Acts passage too, but we see it again here. We gather to exhort and to encourage one another in the faith. Just as in Acts we see them exhorting to fellowship, to worship, to share meals together. Our gatherings are a means by which we love each other and then put that love on display for the sake of the world. And in a day when Christianity has, in many cases, morphed into an individualistic and private affair, me, my Bible, and Jesus kind of thing, the writer of Hebrews reminds us that that is most definitely not the nature of true Christianity. As Paul tells us multiple times, we are part of a body. The body requires all of its parts to function, and each of the parts requires the body to survive. And the body has integrity. I mean, my body, the parts don't have a choice, but that's reflected in Paul's illustration using the body. We should be committed to each other, knowing that we need each other and that every part of the body needs us. So we don't abandon it lightly. And it's important to note that this comes here in Hebrews as an apostolic command. Do not neglect to meet together. That's not advice. That's a command. Like the command to keep the Sabbath, this doesn't mean that we've sinned by missing church due to some necessity or something beyond our control. There are good reasons sometimes. You might be ill. There may be some emergency. For some few who might be truly at great risk in our current situation, there may be a good reason to stay at home. There may be a health issue ordered by the government, which requires we stay at home rather than meeting. There are sometimes good reasons to miss the assembly, or even to cancel the assembly for the whole body on Sunday for a week, or even for a season. But we may not ordinarily neglect it without such a good reason. And I think it's important to add, in light of what has happened across our province, it is wrong for church leaders to deprive the saints of the opportunity to gather short of such a reason. It is one thing for church members in their private judgment and assessing their own risk to absent themselves by choice. It is another thing entirely for the bishop or the pastor or the vestry or to suspend the church's services, depriving the entire body, the entire people of the sacraments and of the opportunity to gather for worship. This is, I think, a grievous wrong. It's one thing if necessity or emergency dictates it. A wildfire surrounds us. An earthquake has made it impossible to gather. Or the government health authority issues an order closing churches. But absent such a situation, the leaders of a church must at least offer the opportunity for the people to come and gather to fulfill that apostolic command. Now, in the absence of competent health authorities issuing orders, the leaders of a church may need to do the best they can, either themselves or in consultation with competent medical authorities or experts, to address these issues. And they might find, absent competent health authorities in the civil government, they may find they have to issue such an order. And that's okay too. But that's not our situation here in British Columbia. It is a grievous wrong for the leaders of a church, short of an emergency, short of an order from the civil magistrate, to deprive the saints of the ability to fulfill this command. Now finally, in talking about ecclesiology, the New Testament puts the Lord's Supper at the center of our worship, alongside the preaching of the Word. You can, as you are right now, watch a recording or a live stream of a sermon, or even of people singing, and you can sing along. But the Lord's Supper requires physical presence as much as it requires physical bread and wine. And we've even muddled this up today. I've watched pastors on live streams, and I don't question their motives. All these people are well-meaning. But they haven't thought this through. They haven't listened to the scriptures or to what our forefathers have so painstakingly worked out for us from the scriptures. I've watched pastors on live streams send people to the kitchen to get simply something to drink and something to eat, even if it's orange juice and Doritos, one pastor said. I watched one pastor pantomime the Lord's Supper, pretending to drink from a pretend chalice, pretending to eat pretend bread, and then pretending to pass it through the computer screen to the people watching. Some in our own tradition have taken to distributing pre-consecrated bread and wine for people to eat during a live stream of a service. Or there are others who think they can have people get bread and wine at home and then consecrate it via the internet. None of these things is the Lord's Supper. The key to the Lord's Supper is not the consecration of the elements. When Jesus blessed the bread and wine at the Passover, he was simply giving a blessing as we do over our own meals, giving thanks to God for what he had provided. The bread and wine don't change into something else in order to make the Lord's Supper the Lord's Supper. The key to the Lord's Supper, just as it was in its precursor, the Passover, the key to the Lord's Supper is the presence of the family, the people of God, gathered to share a meal, to share bread and wine by which we recall and participate in the death and resurrection of Jesus, in the events by which he has delivered generation after generation after generation of believers from our bondage to sin and death, and made us God's people. That's why you cannot celebrate the Lord's Supper alone. Like the Passover, it requires the gathering of the family around the table, physical presence, to eat real bread, to drink real wine. Now, since I brought that up, I want to address one other thing as an aside. I've had a few people say, it's unfair. We don't get communion, but you can have it whenever you want with your family. Brothers and sisters, that's not true. I know there are ministers who do that. But for me, to celebrate the Lord's Supper with my own family in private would be an abuse of the sacrament. It would be like the father eating dinner while his children are unable to eat. Brothers and sisters, your fast is my fast. I will eat the Lord's Supper for the first time again with all of you when we're allowed to meet again together. So, moving on. Now that we've established that gathering together is essential to be in the church, we need to ask the question, what authority does the state have over our gatherings to impose restrictions or to ban them altogether? Does it have authority to do this? Now again, most churches have exposed a dearth of thinking about ecclesiology, but in the last few months I've seen a number of pastors who have taken account the ecclesiology, but now they're preaching things more or less in the line of Jesus is Lord of the church, and the state has no right to tell us that we can't meet. Some of you have forwarded links to me to these sermons so I can watch them or read articles about this kind of thing. And brothers and sisters, this attitude is a problem too. I admire the willingness to take a stand. And in some cases, some of these people may actually be facing government authorities that are showing partiality to them or bias against specifically Christians and churches. And that's a problem. But that is not our problem here. I admire their willingness to take a stand, and at some point in future, it may be necessary for us here to take a stand like that if we face persecution. But at this point in time, most of these guys are ignoring half a millennium of well-developed, well-thought-out Protestant political theology. So I want to address that second. These arguments claiming that the state has no authority over the church are all rooted in a misunderstanding or a misapplication of principles of political theology that go all the way back to Martin Luther and the Reformers. Before the Reformation, the church claimed authority over everything. The church, the family, the state, everything. The arts, that was a big one at the time. The Reformers changed that. Luther wrote of three estates. He said, "But of holy orders and true religious institutions established by God are these three: the office of priest, the estate of marriage, the civil government." In other words, what Luther was saying, and he said this in multiple places in multiple ways, but what he's saying is that God has established three orders or spheres of governance in the world: the family, the church, and the state. More recently, in the last century, the Dutch statesman and theologian Abraham Kuyper developed a similar and related idea that's often referred to as sphere sovereignty. The idea being, and it's a biblically grounded one, just as the ideas of Luther and the Reformers was, that these God-ordained spheres, such as family, church, and state, each have their own authority. And Kuyper's sphere sovereignty has held a major place in Protestant Reformed theology in the last century. So it's not surprising that a lot of these sorts of sermons are coming from that quarter. And I think everyone can agree that there are God-ordained spheres or estates. At least for Protestants, there's nothing controversial about this. And we understand that each has its own authority. But what do we do where they overlap? Because apart from the Old Testament law, which was unique to Israel, the Bible doesn't draw crisp, clean, dark circles around each of these spheres the way some folks today would like to think. That would make things a lot easier on paper, but it would lead to chaos in the real world. The problem is that in the real world, spheres overlap. So it's easy to look at our current situation and declare that the state has no authority to suspend church services, or to declare that there are certain limits on what we can do, whether you have to wear a mask, or whether you can only have a certain number of people, or whether you can't sing. But in reality, none of us actually believes that the state can't do these sorts of things. There are all sorts of situations in which civil authorities can legitimately interfere with our services. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizes the freedom to peaceably assemble, but the Charter also includes what is known as the Reasonable Limits Clause, which recognizes that these rights are not absolute. Now, that's our legal authority in Canada from a civil standpoint. But if we work things out from the Bible, if we understand this idea of estates or spheres, we also understand that there are reasonable limits on the authority of each. So when it comes to something like doctrine, there is a very clear boundary between the authority of the church and the authority of the state. The minister of health, for example, has no authority whatsoever to dictate to us what our doctrine is or should be. He would be seriously overstepping his authority to try to tell us that we should believe this or that as justification for closing our churches. For example, saying that virtual church is just as good as regular church or is an adequate substitute. To make a statement like that is to get into doctrine. That's a matter of doctrine. The state has no authority in that area. But in other matters, the state may intrude on the church's sphere. the state has no say in how churches, for example, choose or ordain ministers. But there are circumstances. Say I was caught embezzling funds from the church. There are circumstances in which the state can rightly bar a guilty clergyman from his job, or at least do something that makes it impossible for him to fill that role. We readily accept that the civil authorities can put occupancy limits on our buildings for reasons of public safety, or noise restrictions on our musical activities so that we don't become a public nuisance. We accept that the fire marshal or building inspector can close our building due to safety concerns. That happened right here in 1974, back when the cenotaph beside our building was dedicated. They wanted to hold a dedicatory service in the building, but the building was in such disrepair that the fire chief barred them from using it. I'll say that fire chief was Lawrence Burns, a man most of you know as a devoted Christian and leader in the local church. In times of war, the state may restrict how and when churches meet. During the Blitz, for example, my understanding is that Londoners were sometimes barred from churches after dark, lest the light become a target for enemy pilots. Plague and pestilence fall into this category as well, and I think we've forgotten because it's been a century since we had a pandemic of this magnitude. We've forgotten that the church has actually addressed these issues for us. And in the past, yes, the church granted that the civil magistrate could put restrictions and even close churches and stop services if serious illness or sickness or pestilence required it. Richard Baxter, one of the finest of the Puritans, wrote this in his catechism. It's question 109. He asks, "May we omit church assemblies on the Lord's Day if the magistrate forbid them?" And the answer? Well, it comes in multiple parts, but here's the answer. 1, it is one thing to forbid them for a time upon some special cause, as infection by pestilence, fire, war, etc., and another to forbid them statedly or profanely. 2, it is one thing to omit them for a time, and another to do it ordinarily. 3, it is one thing to omit them in formal obedience to the law, and another thing to omit them in prudence or for necessity, because we cannot keep them. 4, the assembly and the circumstances of the assembly must be distinguished. And here he goes on in greater detail. He says, if the magistrate, for a greater good, as the common safety, forbid church assemblies in a time of pestilence, assault of enemies, or fire, or the like necessity, it is a duty to obey him. 1, because positive duties give place to those great natural duties which are their end. So he says, for example, so Christ justified himself and his disciples' violation of the external rest of the Sabbath, saying, for the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And 2, because affirmatives bind not ad semper. They bind not always in every circumstance, and out-of-season duties become sins. 3, because one Lord's Day or assembly is not to be preferred before many, which by the omission of that one are like to be obtained. Now, I know sometimes the Puritans are hard to understand, but let me sum that up. Baxter acknowledges the authority of the state overlaps that of the church here. The civil magistrate has every right to impose limits or rules, or even to suspend our gatherings if it is justified in doing so for public health and safety. As Baxter quotes Jesus, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Baxter also reminds us that while a sin is always a sin, in other words, when God commands, thou shalt not murder, there is never any circumstance in which we can justify murder. The same is not true always of God's positive commands. So we are obligated to gather together, and doing so should be normative. And we can probably say it's a sin if we neglect that gathering together for reasons that don't constitute a necessity or an emergency. But there will be times when it's okay not to gather together. Think again about the Sabbath. That's our closest Old Testament illustration. That's what Baxter draws on. Israel was commanded in no uncertain terms to keep the Sabbath, and was even disciplined for not doing so. But that didn't mean leaving your donkey in a ditch or your son down a well on a Saturday in order to keep the Sabbath. To keep the Sabbath while ignoring your neighbor who's in distress actually becomes a sin. So the command to keep the Sabbath is not absolute in the way the command not to murder or not to commit adultery is absolute. And finally, Baxter points out that it may be prudent at times to suspend worship for a short time, if not doing so would mean having to suspend it for a much longer time. And I think that's particularly applicable in our current situation, or at least it potentially is, because that's what our health authorities are trying to do. Now, Baxter's catechism has never had any official authority in any ecclesiastical jurisdiction. So let me quote a short bit of the Augsburg Confession, which is one of the formularies that's authoritative in the Lutheran churches. This is their Article 28 on ecclesiastical power, or at least an excerpt of it. Therefore, the power of the church and the civil power must not be confounded. We can't confuse them. The power of the church has its own commission to teach the gospel and to administer the sacraments. Let it not break into the office of another. Let it not transfer the kingdoms of this world. The church cannot get in to taking over the role of the civil magistrate. But let the church not abrogate the laws of civil rulers. Let it not abolish lawful obedience. Let it not interfere with judgments concerning civil ordinances or contracts. Let it not prescribe laws to civil rulers concerning the form of the commonwealth. Our own Article 37 in the 39 Articles, again an excerpt from it, where we attribute to the King's Majesty the chief government, by which titles we understand the minds of some slanderous folks to be offended. We give not to our princes the ministering either of God's word or of the sacraments, the which thing the injunctions also lately set forth by Elizabeth our Queen do most plainly testify. So, to administer the sacraments, to establish doctrine, that is in the church's sphere. But he says, but that only prerogative, which we see to have been given away to all godly princes in Holy Scriptures by God himself, that is, that they should rule all estates and degrees committed to their charge by God, whether they be ecclesiastical or temporal, and restrain with the civil sword the stubborn and evil doers. Now, our articles aren't quite as explicit as the Augsburg Confession is, but it's saying the same thing. The church has its sphere. The civil government has its sphere. But as a church, we are obligated to submit to the civil government. And as Baxter established, and as we see throughout the writings of the church fathers, the reformers, throughout church history, Christians have understood that, for example, in time of plague or pestilence, the civil magistrate may issue orders regarding the church. Our formularies dictate that we have an obligation to submit. There are aspects of the civil magistrate's authority that rightly and justly overmap the authority of the church, and with some exceptions amongst the Anabaptists, Protestants have always recognized this, because this is part of the practical outworking of St. Paul's exhortation in Romans 13 to be subject to the governing authorities. He says there, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Are there circumstances in which Christians may or are even compelled to disobey the civil magistrate? Most definitely. But this is not one of them. If the magistrate were to require we do something sinful, in the early church it was to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar to acknowledge his divinity and to acknowledge loyalty to him. If it were something like that, we would be bound to disobey. But suspending church services for a limited period of time because of a pandemic is not one of those situations. It is not a sin to cancel our corporate worship out of necessity and at the order of the health minister. Now finally, that tells us about our ecclesiology and our political theology. Finally, what do we do if we disagree with the health orders? I mean, the government has the authority to issue these things. But what if they're doing it in error? Let me approach this from two angles. First, there has been a lot of talk about these health orders and talking about it in terms of persecution of the church, as if our government is hostile to Christians. Now, there may be some places in this world right now where governmental authorities are using the pandemic as an excuse to persecute the church. That may be true somewhere else. But brothers and sisters, it is foolish, it is irresponsible, it is slanderous to say that to our leaders here in British Columbia. Consider our health minister and our premier are both churchgoers. Now, they belong to very liberal churches that we would likely consider heretical in their beliefs, but they are religious people. And they have made it clear on multiple occasions that they value religion and even church. Our health minister has said repeatedly how often he misses being able to go to church. Second, the health orders in BC target everyone, not just Christians. They have not singled us out. And I think it's important to stop the persecution talk right now. That may really come someday. But folks, don't do it today. It's crying wolf. It's irresponsible. It's not happening here now. But let's say hypothetically, let's say these orders were unfairly aimed at churches. I think the best test to determine whether or not that's the case is to look at what's happening in theaters or with concerts, things of that nature. Is the government allowing theaters to operate or concerts to go on? In terms of a pandemic, those venues would be the most comparable to a church or church service. If churches were ordered closed, but theaters were still open, then we would probably have a case to claim persecution, or at the least, that we're being unfairly singled out. But that is not the case in British Columbia right now. I know it seems absolutely stupid that you can't go to church, but you can still go buy liquor and dope. But there's a reason why that's the case. The fact is that shopping, whatever you're shopping for, is a less risky situation than sitting in a room full of people for an hour or two, whether it's to watch a movie, listen to a concert, or attend a church service. But if we perceive the health orders to be imposing an unjust bias on us, let's say hypothetically, would we then be justified in engaging in civil disobedience, as some are doing? No. And let me explain why. Scripture obligates us, as we have seen, to be subject to the governing authorities. That means, if we're going to be subject to the governing authorities, that means we must first avail ourselves of all the means of redress that our system of government has provided. And it has provided them. We can contact our MLA. We can write to our premier. We can write to our health minister. And even though they've made it rather difficult, we can write to our provincial health officer. If that doesn't get us anywhere, we have recourse to the courts. These are all avenues that we need to exhaust before we can justifiably engage in civil disobedience, when the issue at stake is not one that involves sin. If we did otherwise, we would be disregarding Scripture's command to be subject to the governing authorities, and that would be a problem. Now, why is it important? Well, consider how our relation with the civil authorities impacts our witness as Christians. This is what lies behind most of what the New Testament has to say on the subject. Paul urges Timothy to pray for those in authority. The idea, he writes, is that, quote, we lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Christians should not be known for creating chaos and constantly raging against the civil authorities. The scenes we saw this week in Washington, D.C., of people holding signs essentially saying we're somehow connected with the church or with Jesus, and then raging and creating chaos. That is not what Christians should be known for. Paul similarly wrote to Titus. He said in Titus 3:1 and 2, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Now, Paul there hits some of us close to home. It's easy to quarrel about these things. And it's easy to cross the line from legitimate and godly criticism and commentary into speaking evil. I know the struggle, but struggle we must. And sometimes we fail. I know this past week I posted something on Facebook about Darth Bonnie altering the deal. And I probably shouldn't have posted that. It was meant to be a semi-humorous relief to or comment on a difficult and discouraging situation. And it wasn't meant to be offensive, but I recognized after the fact, not everybody understands the Star Wars reference that it draws on, and not everybody understands that it's become an internet meme that's meant to be funny. So we need to be careful. Our civil leaders in BC have shown nothing but that they are well-intentioned. We may disagree with what they're doing, but they are not out to get us. So part of our witness is being peaceable, agreeable people as much as we are able to without compromising the gospel. So Peter in particular addresses that aspect of it. He says, again, 1 Peter 3, verses 3 to 15, he writes, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." Christians should be the last people known as troublemakers. That doesn't mean we shouldn't stand up for our rights, but it does mean that we need to make sure that when we do it with respect and in the least disruptive and the most gracious way possible. And that gets to the final point I want to make here. Part of what's going on in BC is our own fault, and we need to acknowledge that. The day before this social lockdown was put into place, Adrian Dix and Bonnie Henry held one of their periodic conference calls with faith leaders. In that call, they thanked religious communities for having done such a good job. They noted that there have been no issues with public religious gatherings when the protocols they've given us have been followed. And this is why so many were shocked when the next day the health order issued shut us down. Archbishop Miller, the senior Roman prelate in the province, wrote a letter of protest. A law professor at UBC wrote a letter stating that this kind of action was likely unconstitutional. You cannot suspend a charter right without good reason. And none had been given. When Dix and Henry responded a couple of days later in one of their press conferences, it was to say that with the goal of keeping businesses and schools open, they were curtailing what they deemed to be social activities. And this makes sense to a great extent. We have seen that most business and educational activities haven't posed a great threat. Community spread was happening largely in social gatherings, and so that's what they targeted. The problem is that churches had proved ourselves safe and low risk, and the authorities admitted that freely, literally the day before. When confronted about this the next week in one of the press conferences, Henry brushed it off, showing quite a bit of annoyance, and rightly pointed out that social gatherings had been a problem, but then unjustifiably and without any further explanation, lumped public religious gatherings into that same general category of social gatherings. Legally, the authorities need to provide some kind of reasonable evidence that our services are a credible threat to public health before curtailing them. They have not done this. And I think this is a point that could potentially be challenged in court. But I also don't think it's likely to go anywhere. Why? Because the vast majority of Christians in British Columbia sent a clear message back in the spring. The health authorities permitted us to meet. They put caps on our attendance. They gave us safety measures we needed to have in place. But we could meet. And the vast majority of churches in our province shut down anyway. When other jurisdictions were ordering churches closed, the authorities here, knowing how important our public gatherings are and that they are a guaranteed chartered right, allowed us to continue to meet. I was thrilled at the time. We were one of the few Reformed Episcopal churches. We were one of the few churches in North America, in the Anglican Church in North America. We were one of the few that was still able to meet, because our health authorities understood how important it is that we be able to meet. And yet what happened? Every other church in the Comox Valley closed its doors. And the same thing happened across the province. We here in British Columbia were handed an immense privilege. And we were in a unique situation in North America. And most churches, most Christians and church leaders in British Columbia threw it away. The church at large in BC sent a very clear and loud message to our authorities, who at the time were bending over backwards so that we could continue to meet. The church sent a very loud and clear message that the corporate gathering of the saints is not really all that important to us. And that, I think, is a good reason for us to be circumspect in our protest. The majority of our church leaders, our brothers and our sisters, have sent a message to the government that it is okay for the government to shut us down without demonstrating that we posed a threat to public health. And so the response from the government and the response from the public to protest and to churches that are defying the orders is something like, stop being troublemakers. Physical gatherings aren't that important. See, all of those other churches who supposedly believe the same thing you do, all of those other churches shut down and nobody asked them to. The church isn't a building. You're out of line with your fellow religionists. I see that over and over and things like it in comments on news stories and articles on Facebook and other social media. And so we protest and our witness just goes down in flames. Now, friends, I don't have all the answers as to how we rebuild from here. It will take a lot of wisdom and a lot of wise Christians working together. It will take the education of the church at large. And I don't know how realistic that is. I mean, consider, I have said nothing here today that is new or that is my own novel interpretation. Everything I've said this morning is what the church has been saying for hundreds of years. The problem is that much of the church, many of the clergy, have simply stopped listening to our forefathers, stopped paying attention to our history, stopped paying attention to our doctrinal formularies. So brothers and sisters, at this time, all I can say is we need to pray for our leaders. We need to pray for our community. We need to pray for the larger church. And in this difficult time, we need to be faithful to our witness to the best of our ability. This means being good citizens under the current difficult circumstances. I think it's also a time in which the Lord is reminding us that there's more to being the church than gathering on Sunday mornings. We aren't able to do that. But there are plenty of other things that we can potentially be doing to witness Jesus to the world. Perhaps things that we have not been faithful in doing when we have been faithful to gather. So some words of that great Anglican divine, one of our formative theologians, Richard Hooker, I think are fitting. Hooker wrote at a time when there was a great deal of contention and quarreling and controversy in the Church of England. And this is what he wrote in the preface to his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. He wrote, "In the meantime, shall there be no doings? Hardly. There are the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things we ought to do, and these things, while we contend about less, we leave undone. Happy those whom the Lord comes and finds doing them instead of quarreling." Friends, we cannot meet together, but we can be faithful in witnessing the justice and mercy of the kingdom. And I cannot think of a time when the world needs that witness more than it does now. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning, a people dispersed by order of our government. and we pray for your mercy. Deliver us from this time of sickness. Give wisdom to our leaders that they might deal with us justly and restore us to our fellowship. Fill us with wisdom and grace, we ask, that we might respond to our governing authorities with humility and work for the reformation of your church with all godliness. We ask this through Jesus our Lord. Amen. Now go in peace to love and serve the Lord.